Hello everyone, this is Jahiria A. Abbas and today we are going to talk about ELE 150 or English for Specific Purposes.
Last meeting, Mr. Sumandal have discussed to you all about the methodologies for teaching or approach in teaching of ESP. He have identified the methodologies, which is the first one we have the input. He talked about all about input. What is input again? Yes, basically input is what goes into the minds, whereas explicit instruction should be needed in order to have this kind of input given by the teacher. But today, I am going to teach you another methodology of relating input to output. So first, what is output? Output is what goes out. Output is some kind of a product, whereas you use it after the input. But as said before, that ESP is not a product, but rather a process. So, this can be the applications of the input that we have told for the students, and then also the authentic use in terms of measuring if the learner have learned something or not. The first one here is we have the input to output. Input to output. In this strategy, students are provided with input as basis for production or the output. The lack of sufficient use of this strategy can be inferred in the following criticism made of methodology in ESP. According to Scott, 1984, on his page 217, he said that a common failing in teaching is to expect high-level production without giving sufficient input. Of course, when you are expecting output from the students, there should be sufficient input in order to produce an output. In the instruction based on this strategy, the focus of this is on students acquiring explicit knowledge of preselected language items. The teacher selects pre-specific items such as target linguistic forms or features as the focus of instruction. For applying input to output in ESP, the input to output option is used for teaching different aspects of language, including genre knowledge, whereas according to Badger and White 2000, describe the practice of understanding the input and applying the rules or the output in the practice of genre instruction in ESP. So the input would be the knowledge that is given, and then the output would be the application of it or the rules of the input given, and then the practicing of it in certain contexts or genre instructions on a certain subject to either measure it. Now, the next one, we have the output-based strategies. What are output-based strategies? So are these more like output? Yes, of course. This is also known as the task-based strategy. The output-based strategy or instruction takes as its starting point students' efforts to communicate in the target language. Two strategies can be identified. The first is based on the premise that using the language or producing output is sufficient for learning, and the second on the premise that it is only when students' production or output is followed by some form of input or discussion or highlighting of language that learning occurs. Next one, we have predominantly output. Predominantly output is instruction it's instruction based, whereas on the predominantly output strategy, students are placed in situations that require them to perform production tasks to produce output at the outset of a lesson or activity. The rationale is that through producing language, students can identify where their interlanguage or developing language system is sufficient for the performance or production task and where it is not. According to Swain, 1985 to 1998, he argues that in being pushed to produce, language learners notice holes in their linguistic repertoire, and this stimulates learning of language to fill in the holes. Thus, it is through being required to use language that once language develops, because while endeavoring to communicate through the language, learners become aware of missing elements in their linguistic repertoire. So the more you have common practices of using more of this task-based or output, you tend to look at the gaps or these kinds of holes in the performance that you did, and what happens is you tend to have some kind of input from all those output that you have done. In addition to this, a key idea in this output hypothesis is that learners develop a second language when you push them to do so. The evidences of the theory, according to Pika's study reported in Ellis, they show that learners' output become more grammatically accurate following exchanges in their interlocutor requested clarification from them compared to the exchanges in which the interlocutor simply requested confirmation. Basically, on certain extent, when you apply the situation, when the more the person communicates, the more they think that the language that they are speaking are actually different from those of the native-like speakers. And then, last but not the least, we have the output to input. This is contrast to the first one, whereas its concept in instruction base is an output to input strategy. The output to input strategy, students' production or output, is followed by feedback. Students perform a task and feedback is provided to show a more native-like performance. The aim is that the students notice how their own performances or how their own output differs from the more native-like model, similar to the other ones, but here, the feedback is very much given importance. The feedback stage may be followed by a further optional stage in which students perform the task. During task production, students notice holes in their linguistic repertoire or resources. So it's actually similar to the ones that I've had talked before, but the importance of the feedback here would probably give the input to the students for them to really notice what their lacks and gaps or holes are. No, the strategy does not involve a focus or specified linguistic items. There are no particular language forms that are targeted for instruction, although a general area may be halimbawa, or for example, how to make the request or doing a business proposal for others. Feedback may be given or on any number of language items that was happening during the task or the output that was being practiced. These are to give feedback to the whole class or to individual students, like by pairs or by groups, whereas the teachers collect examples of these errors or interesting aspects of the language that they were using during the production or the output stage. Furthermore, on this last kind of methodology, in the output to input strategy, the learning activity or task functions to create the condition for students to notice a hole in their linguistic repertoire and produce data for feedback. Activities in the input stage provides opportunities for students to notice the gap by comparing their output in more native-like performances. Do you understand that? Okay, if you have any questions, please comment down below your questions so that we'll be able to understand more of this. So that's basically all about the output. I hope you have understood it. Bye and thank you.